Today, we've got questions on private property, telepaths, and Charles answers, is society where it's at as a result of the Enlightenment? Welcome to another episode of Off the Menu. I'm your host, Vincent Franchini from Tumblr House, here with a supercalifragilisticexpialidocious, Charles Coulombe.
You know, even though the sound of it is really quite atrocious. Supercalifragilisticexpialidocious. What are you trying to do? Send me back to the Disney of my youth, of my childhood?
That was a request from the patrons, so I just do what they say. I just facilitate. But yeah, Mary Poppins, Dick Van Dyke.
Well,
that's pretty good
I
stuff.
think they're both still alive.
Dick Van Dyke's gonna outlive us all. That man, he looks good too. He is 99 years old.
I think it's going to end up being a fight to the death over the remnants of the world between Dick Van Dyke and Keith Richards.
I knew you were gonna say that.
The two of them will stand over the charred remnants of our world. My money's on Dick Van Dyke, though. He represents the forces of goodness.
Keith Richards is 81. Okay.
I love the meme during COVID. It showed him looking kind of out of it, saying COVID-19 used to smoke that back in the 60s.
Ah. Of course. Who do you like more, the Beatles or the Stones?
Oh, Beatles.
Yeah.
Just not even a question.
Yeah. Okay. Why? Why would you say that, though? Can you expound on that?
Well, yeah, I can expound on that. There was a playfulness to the Beatles, a lot of their work, that was lacking in the Stones. The Stones they're nasty. I mean, and mind you, the Beatles can be nasty too, but I mean, compare what's his face. God, I can't even think of his his name.
Mick Jagger?
Mick Jagger, yes. Compare Mick Jagger to Paul McCartney. Now, which of the two would you rather have a drink with?
Well, definitely Paul McCartney. I mean, without a doubt. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think, despite I certainly was not a John Lennon fan. Ringo, of course, was the Beatle one didn't care about anyway. And George, was off being Christian. But both as a Beatle and as a soloist, Paul McCartney was, I think, worth any of the Stones or all of them put together. I don't know what he's like as a person, but he's always seemed pleasant in a way that Jagger and Richards and the rest of them just don't.
Yeah. Okay. That sounds good.
It's this is a typically boomer assertion. This is the kind of thing we have our boomer gatherings. Then we have boomer conventions. The word goes out from Boomer Central. We have to be reprogrammed and set about our tasks. Inflicting on younger people what needs to be inflicted upon them. And we accept that happily as a task that Boomer Central gives us.
So you guys are almost like the Borg. You've got the Boomer hive mind.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, resistance is futile. That's true. And in case you're wondering where Boomer Central is, it's in Detroit.
Why would you? Why? Why
Motown.
Is that? Motown?
Motown.
Really?
The Motor City.
I mean, I would, as a noob to boomerism, I would have guessed San Francisco.
Well, we certainly have centers there. We have San Francisco's centers in Frisco, a lot of places. Berkeley, of course, Sedona, Mount Shasta.
Well, I mean, I say that too because San Francisco is a beautiful city and Detroit's a dump.
It is now. It is now, but it is, 1960 what? 1960 who?
What?
The the mo the Motor City's burning, y'all. That ain't right.
Your refutation as to whether or not Detroit is a ugly is a dump is to
It
simply
was not
cite.
always. It was not always a dump.
What was it like? What was it like in its heyday?
In its heyday, it was filled with clubs, restaurants. It was a very prosperous place because of all the automobile factories. The name Motown, the Motor City, was because of all the car factories, and there were tons of working class families who made a very good income off working in the factories. And there was an artistic center to the town. Uh, some of the first rock and roll, especially of the darker variety, came roaring out of Motown.
So are you really telling me that if we pulled all the boomers out there and we give them a set of options of some of these prominent cities that they're going to all pick Detroit?
No, probably not. I think Frisco. You're right. Frisco is probably Boomer Central more than Detroit.
Okay, there we go.
It's sad though, because firstly, I think it's racism that denies Detroit its rightful place. That's part of it. But then again, where was the human bee in? It was in Golden Gate Park. Where was the sociological as opposed to the political center of the movement? Haight-Ashbury, Summer of Love. And I think, you know, if you're going to San Francisco, be sure to wear some flowers in your hair.
I didn't ask for this, Charles. I asked a simple question. Okay, maybe no, I did ask you to.
You did ask for it.
Okay.
You opened the door and the boomer spirits came in. You're like Mickey Mouse as the Sorcerer's Apprentice in Fantasia. Only it's boomerism. It's the age of Aquarius that came up.
Wow, that's an image right there. That's a scary image. I'm picturing
Yeah, it
I'm
is.
picturing all
Pretty
those
threatening.
mops with all those buckets of water and dancing.
Yeah, only they're rather than the music they perform to, they're all performing to the Stones and the Beatles. It's I want to hold your hand. Last thing you want is a mop coming up to you and singing that you. Especially a mop in a bucket.
Whew. All right.
So the real question though that I think this brings, what people of your age and younger don't understand is that my generation was set to change the world. You know what I mean? I mean, we were the product of the victors of World War II, the survivors of the Depression, and we were going to remake the world. It was going to be more loving, more open, more just, more kind. It was everyone was going to be who they were. You know what I'm saying? We were going to let the now happen. You know what I mean? And it was just yeah. I mean, this was it just because I mean, you know what I mean? It really was yeah. And see, it could have been, but unfortunately, we came up against an enemy we couldn't overcome.
which is
Reality.
so. Let me ask you this: Do you think, in the long run, there's going to be a reaction against that generation? Because we're still living the fruits of it. We still implicitly have all these values of that generation in terms of smoking weed, sexual liberation, et cetera, environmentalism to the extreme. Do you think we're going to go the other way?
Eventually. I mean, you got to think now where, for the purposes of so-called climate change, the governments of Europe want to destroy half of their agricultural sectors.
Right.
Without any care as to what that's going to mean for their populations.
Right.
in terms of not just the higher cost of food, but even its availability.
Yeah.
And that's utterly crazy. And it can't end well if it's allowed to continue this way. Now, the reaction that appears to be building may go somewhere, but reactions, they go somewhere. Very often they don't go nice places. Uh, I think, in a certain sense, the action and the reaction, the whole drama is going to have to play itself out.
Well,
And
I guess I might, because that makes sense, right? Like everyone knows it goes the opposite direction in an unfun way, but given the attributes of that generation, how do you go the other way in an unfun way?
well,
You know?
a lot of ways. I mean, for one thing, um, what you could what you could do is an unquestioning rejection of everything that a generation. And again, this is wild overgeneralizations, obviously, because not certainly I wasn't. Not every boomer was a hippie by any stretch, but it's true enough for government work, as they used to say. Stereotypes work because sufficient people live them, although you'll find lots and lots of exceptions to any stereotype. But anyway, basically, when the system is no longer sustainable, when I've often said that as long as we still have need for obesity commercials, things aren't really that bad. When we no longer need those, when people are skinny enough because they can't find enough food, that's when the real reaction will begin. Now, when will that happen? I don't know. 5 years, 10 years, 20, 30, 40? I don't know. I hope I don't see it, but I'm afraid you will. Um, you know, because the problem is what has been rejected are the very building stones of any stable society, you know, and you can't maintain that forever. And eventually, uh, at some point, we'll hit whatever passes for rock bottom and things will begin to turn around. But when they do, and those people, some of whom may be alive today, maybe not, maybe it'll be further in the future, but they will look back and they will curse us. They will absolutely curse us. And that in itself will be a bit unfair, simply because we didn't pop out of a Jack in the Box either. There were reasons why we were the way we were. I mean, if history in the end doesn't allow anyone to be smug, it nevertheless usually provides an awful lot of mitigating circumstances. My dad used to point to World War II as a major effect on the older boomers, bearing in mind that the boom started in '44, uh, because it was in the aftermath of a whole generation going without fathers for 4 years, of women rushed into the workplace, of geographical disruption for a ton of people. The divorce rate skyrocketed after World War II because you had a lot of men come home from the war, and they weren't the men who marched away.
Just thinking about this more, it's interesting because there were some positive attributes to come out of that at least in terms of ideals
Oh yeah,
that that generation represented. For example, I felt like they had a great sense of community.
yeah,
They were more about sort of they're against corporations, right?
yeah.
They're against consumerism. And so my question is, what happened there?
Well, what happened was several things. Firstly, a lot of that was more shadow than substance. I mean, you read books like The Greening of America or the making of a counterculture, both of which Theodore Roosevelt was making of a counterculture. I forget who wrote The Greening of America, but they look at just those kinds of aspects. And Tolkien himself was kind of baffled by a lot of his hippie fans. Nevertheless, said, there's a lot more than just the cults, as he put it, of fainéants and filth. There's also a yearning for cavaliers and a dislike of conformity and so on. I'm freely misquoting, but that's the basis of it. And that's what brought you the Renaissance fairs. That's what brought you the revels, the Christmas revels. I mentioned the Christmas revels. It's what brought you the Society for Creative Anachronism, which I have to admit I've never been able to get into, although it's active in Monrovia. Um, I think because it demands a lot more out of you than the Renaissance Fair does. The SCA is sort of a lifestyle, whereas the Renaissance Fair is just a play you do, a long running play. But at any rate, that stuff was all quite nice. The expansion of fantasy, science fiction, etc. I mean, by my way of thinking, it was all good things. But they did not address, they were all essentially surface. And they did not address the real problem with the technological state, with the technocracy, as the author of The Greening of America called it, because the essential problem with it is religious. They were right in the sense that culture is more important than politics. Culture precedes politics. That was something they saw very clearly, and that a lot of people do not see today. What they did not understand was that religion precedes culture. And they liked the externals, hence the Renaissance Fair, hence Tolkien. They liked the externals, but the internals were a bit beyond them. And it didn't help that the church herself, her leadership anyway, were turning their backs on what had always characterized the faith up until that time. Because all the while that the boomers were going on, the leadership, the Catholic Church leadership, were deconstructing. And I've always thought, I could be wrong, but I've always thought that in Maclean's great song/poem, American Pie, that he touches on this in the last verse when he says, I went down to the sacred store where I heard the music years before, but the men there said the music wouldn't play. Reminds me of a mutual friend of ours, who left the church. He comes back and it's, and then and in the church, in the streets, the children screamed, the lovers wept, and the poets streamed. Not a word was spoken. The church bells all were broken. And the three men I admire most, the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost, they caught the last train for the coast the day the music died. In that song, it seems to me, and I could be wrong, but it's how it's always appeared to me, looking over its lyrics these 40, 50 years, you see that the experience of a whole generation going from one thing to another, trying to find some sort of meaning in it all, and not here, not there, not the next thing. And finally, he turns back to his faith, and that's gone. That's changed. So, fortunately, we know that they didn't actually catch the last train for the coast. And despite trash can custodians, the music still plays in a number of sacred stores. Despite little old women from Latin American countries who shriek and yap,
Hmm.
and non-binary persons from Latin American countries who shriek and yap.
All right.
Even English red-hatted cockroaches who yell and scream and little mouths jump up and down. Well, the music still plays at a number of sacred stores. The church bells aren't broken. And the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost are quite as much here as anywhere, although, of course, they are by definition also at the coast.
Hmm.
And notice they caught the last train to the coast and not that midnight train to Georgia.
Well, I thought the devil went down to Georgia.
He was looking for a soul to steal.
So you don't want to take that midnight train down there.
No, you don't. You don't. But he missed out on Sweet Home Alabama.
That's right. All right. We can keep doing this. We can keep going.
It's the glory train.
Charles, I hear you're going to California.
With my banjo on my knee.
All right. What's new with you, Charles?
Well, several things. I'm not going to California, but tomorrow morning I'm going to London once again. And I'll be in London until Thursday. Then I'm coming back here to Austria. And that's the last time I expect to travel until mid-April. But I'm going for a conference, and I'm tired. I'm sleepy.
Oh,
You know.
seeing all the sites on in all of old Christendom, that must be so tedious and difficult. And socializing with all the people. I know, Charles. An
You don't know
unsung
what I've
hero.
been through. It's unsung hero. Yes. See, finally somebody gets it. An unsung hero. I'm suffering for everyone else. And let me tell you something else. If that weren't the case, all right, they're changing the gods at Buckingham Palace. Christopher Robin went down with Alice. They're wondrous parties within the grounds, but I wouldn't be king for £1,000, says Alice.
What is that from?
A. Milne, Christopher Robin's daddy.
Wow.
Winnie the Pooh's author.
All right.
And the joke in it, you see, is Alice saying she wouldn't be king for £1,000. And obviously, as a woman, she's not going to be.
I see.
But at any rate, what else is going on? As you know, Monday, the 19th, when people will be seeing this, is the legal observance of Washington's birthday. It's a federal holiday. But when I was a boy, we had to celebrate them on the actual days, so they still meant something. And what is that day? It's February 22nd.
All right.
And it is tomorrow, Sunday, is Septuagesima. So it is the beginning of the season of Carnival, Mardi Gras, Fasching, Pre-Lent, Shrovetide, all those things.
Ash Wednesday, March 5th. Okay, we got some time.
Oh, yeah. And then March 3rd is what we call Rosenmontag, Rose Monday, or Faschingmontag, or Lundi Gras, Fat Monday. Then comes Mardi Gras. Are you going to go to some Louisiana restaurant for Mardi Gras?
Do we even have those over here, Charles? I mean, other than Popeye's chicken, I guess. You know? I don't think we have those over here.
We used to. I mean, I used to go. There was one on, I forget the name of it now, but there's a really good one we used to go to in Monrovia. And every Mardi Gras they would have, they even made gumbo zerbe, vegetarian gumbo for Lent. Let's see, Louisiana restaurant.
You're probably going to
Arcadia.
Oh, Arcadia? Okay. I was going to say Bubba Gump's in City Walk near Universal Studios, but that's pretty touristy.
Yeah, that won't do at all. Sharon's Cafe. All right, here we go. The 10 best Cajun Creole near Arcadia. Chick-fil-A. Well, that's Arcadia, Louisiana. That's not going to do us any good. Arcadia, CA.
I don't think there's
All
going to
right.
be anything, Charles. I really don't.
Oh, you think not?
I feel like I know my town pretty well. I don't think there's going to be anything there.
You don't think so? You don't think so, really?
You're
Well,
you're,
there's
you're just not finding anything, are you? Because there's nothing here, Charles.
that's a lie.
What?
Does Highland Park count?
Highland Park? Where is that? I don't even know where that is.
It's down the 110. Um. Oh, this is annoying. Um. Why can't things be the way I want them to be? Why is that so hard for people? Now, there's the stinking crawfish in Monrovia, which is where margaritas used to be. A Cajun crawfish stop. Oh, in downtown, there's the little Jewel of New Orleans, if it's still going. But in Covina, the crawfish stop. No, it's like the stinking crawfish. It says Cajun/Creole seafood Vietnamese. See, that's always the giveaway.
Wow.
Always the giveaway. They do have gumbo though.
I'm sorry, Charles. We don't have that kind over here. We don't serve your kind. All right.
No, I guess not. I guess not. It's well, Harold and Bell's, of course, but you wouldn't go there, I'm sure. Uh, Cajun Creole seafood, Uncle John's Cafe downtown. Um, I wonder if this is where the new Jewel of New Orleans was. It's downtown. Yeah, American Chinese Vietnamese. You know what it is? There are a lot of Vietnamese that went to Louisiana. Uh, lots, a lot for the fishing. And so, like the stinking crawfish, the reason why, I mean, I've been there, the food's good, but it's Cajun Creole and Vietnamese.
Hmm.
And that's because you had a lot of Vietnamese who went to Louisiana after the war, went into fishing. You find them in Alabama and Mississippi too on the coast.
Makes sense.
Well, I mean, don't get me wrong, I like Vietnamese food and I love Cajun food, Creole food, but I don't like them necessarily all together.
You don't like fusion.
No, because usually it's a con job. That's why we call it confusion.
Oh. Okay. Very good. All right.
Which, however, is the guardian of truth.
That's my mantra. All right. Ryan has a fun comment. So obviously we did that talk on the pre-show and then the mini segment on Our Lady of Knock. You know, the
Yes.
Irish apparition. He's Ryan says, Mick here. One conspiracy about Knock is that Our Lady spoke Irish and the clergy couldn't have that getting out.
Well, okay. Okay, Ryan. I was there a day and a week ago.
And
I was there a week ago Friday at Knock, and a week ago today I was in beautiful Galway at at the conference, at the Round Tower conference.
yeah,
And you know something interesting happened to me there?
what?
I was asked to sing. We went out afterwards, after the conference, but there was a lady singing, a lady singer my age or older, with an accompanist, and she was doing Elvis Presley. And there was this elderly man who was throwing his arms about in the most weirdest jerky manner possible, and it was kind of embarrassing. So I went up to her. I said, "Could we do Whiskey in the Jar?" Well, we did. it was the most difficult and embarrassing version of Whiskey in the Jar I've ever done, because I did it to her beat and singing with her.
Yeah.
So it turned into, as I went out a rambling o'er the western Kerry mountains, I met with Captain Farrell and his money he was counting. I mean, it turned into kind of a weird ballad as opposed to, as I went out a rambling the western Kerry mountains. You see the difference.
Yeah.
But it was a bit more like Elvis than like the Dubliners. That, you know, Ronnie Drew would have shot me, I think. But it's okay.
Hmm.
You know, I'm a part of what was Dublin in the rare old times. The Pillar and the Met are gone. The Royal long since pulled down.
Beatles or Elvis?
Oh, Beatles. I think, again, I'd rather spend time with Paul McCartney than Elvis.
All right. All right.
You had a hard-headed woman, soft-hearted man. I could never figure out what he was saying there.
All right, questions. Time for some questions, and we've got a bunch of really good questions on this episode.
All right.
From Carl, he says, recently I was reading some public comments on a new government program. One of the comments claimed to be upset with government spending and overreach, claiming that private land ownership rights were a reason for overthrowing King George. Kind of confused me, but it also made me laugh, particularly as our private property rights are inherited from the monarchs of England, France, Spain. I
No.
have to wonder if anyone believes Squanto and his peers surveyed the continent and administered deeds. At any rate, Charles has articulated how this process manifested itself in the New World. Please ask Charles how private property rights began in Europe and the collective Old World. Also, when and how did property taxes begin?
Well, it all begins with feudalism, really, in the sense that initially the real taxpayers, so to speak, were the great lords, all of whom held their land of the king. The king was the lord of the land, and he assigned it to his great lords. Now, in England, as opposed to the rest of the continent, where you had intermediary vassals, in England the king was the immediate lord of everybody. Um, Property taxes began really with the providing of either troops or supplies for the king's needs, the king's army, and so on. Tenants didn't pay rent in the form of cash because it didn't really exist. I mean, it existed, but it wasn't as we have it today. So they generally paid in the form of crops, and these, of course, would go into barns, and from there they'd be used. Uh, the that element that would go to the church, the tithe, would go into a special kind of barn called, you guessed it, a tithe barn. But the money economies in Europe emerged, I guess, starting in the 1400s, and more uh, produce produce rents were transformed into cash. Um, and I mean, at the same, but this is a gradual process. It didn't happen overnight. And you had the rise of market towns and fairs and things like that, uh, all of which stimulated the growth of the money economy over barter and so on. But the king's taxes uh, became wider and wider as feudalism broke down. So, for instance, in France, the great feudal lords, one by one, their lordships were absorbed into the French crown lands, as they were called. Philip Augustus in the 1100s only ruled directly the area around Paris, Ile d'Orléans, and directly south to it, the area around Orléans, the Orléanais. All the rest of it was in the hands of the dukes, the Duke of Burgundy, the Duke of Aquitaine, and so on. As time went on, each of these characters became fused with the royal dominions, and so taxes became direct. Although they still had feudal lords, they weren't the great noblemen they had been. Um, and there were still obligations to them. I mean, even in Quebec, in the first settlement, when we had the seigneuries, the tenants were obligated, for instance, to grind their wheat at the seigneur's mill. But gradually, as feudalism broke down, taxation, property taxes became wider and wider and wider. It varied from country to country, place to place, but it was you might say, an organic development. It wasn't, people didn't sit down and figure it out.
What was private property like? Like, how did they manage it in ancient Rome? Maybe during Pax Romana and stuff like that in the city of Rome.
Well, that varied too. I mean, originally, Rome, the Roman countryside was filled with small farmers who held their land directly. But as time went on and farming became less and less uh, profitable on a small scale, you had the emergence of latifundia, of these big estates run by slaves, worked by slaves. And, the owners of each of these could pay a lot more in the way of tax than the smallholders could have. Now, the downside was that those smallholders had been the backbone of the Roman army. And so, with their disappearance as a class, the damage, I guess you would say, to Roman society was enormous.
Hmm. All right. Carl has another question. He says, a few years ago, I was listening to an interview of someone from the former Soviet Union. In the interview, they expressed that many in the region dislike the book Gulag Archipelago because it has been used to make them look bad for tolerating communist atrocities. Even though the people of the Soviet Union were the victims of the atrocities. It made me think of what true reconciliation looks like. In that, what point does human nature harden one's resolve and incentivizes one to quote unquote embrace the bad? In other words, if you think so little of us, why should we apologize for supposed indiscretions? I think many young men today feel this way. Well, why apologize for a sin we didn't commit when there's no chance for forgiveness? Is this typically how paradigms have changed in history, or is it just a further fractioning of our society?
Well, I think firstly, the whole problem with fault finding like that uh, is that very, 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 very few people are cut out to be heroes. And that's probably just as well, because if they were, we'd have run out of people a long time ago. Um, but I mean, one of the examples I've used over and over, 50 years ago when I was a boy, the vast majority of people believed that abortion was murder. Now, obviously, the Supreme Court imposed it on us, and during that time, the education, media, and government industries propagandized their serfs, and now the majority of people believe it's a sacred right. But what if 50 years hence our descendants felt about it the way our grandfathers did? How would they look at us?
Hmm.
They'd look at us pretty badly. And they would ask, they would say, well, how come you guys didn't do anything about it? But you see, it'd be hard to explain what's to do unless you're willing to do Operation Rescue or refuse to pay income tax because it goes to abortion. You know, you lived with it. I lived with it. Everyone lives with it, except those few heroic people who don't. Uh, the during our time, I mean, if our descendants look at this period and abortion the way we look at communism or Nazism, not only will we look very bad, i- what we were supposed to do, what overthrow the government? How are we going to do that? With what? And how would that have helped in the end? The fact is that only a small percentage of the population are heroes, and of that, only a smaller portion are prepared to be martyrs. So this is why, when my generation in Europe, the generation of '68, had all their rabble rousing in '68, and they attacked their parents for not doing anything during the war, it was horribly unfair. What are they supposed to do? What are they going to do? You know, it's easy to demand heroism out of other people. Not so easy to be a hero yourself. Um, so when you speak of reconciliation and all that, um, first you've got to presume moral superiority on the part of the questioner. And while someone who, say, suffered the slings and arrows during such a regime might have a right to do that, the descendants do not, because they weren't there.
Hmm.
They don't know. And often enough, the answer would be, so you'd be alive.
Hmm.
I compromised with evil, so you would have a life. That's why.
This is kind of an abstract question that Carl has presented us. There's a couple different ways to go. I think a different way, because he's talking about incentivizing, quote unquote, embracing the bad. To me, that makes me think of. So are we? Because if people will hate us anyway, if the cancel culture, there's no appeasing them. If they just hate, to what
No.
extent is everyone going to collectively embrace the bad and have a reaction against cancel culture?
And what would that look
And
like?
yeah, exactly.
I don't know. I could tell you that it might be unfortunate. Um,
But I do see this trend. This happened with Vice President Vance. I forgot what he
yeah.
did. He had some. Um, I don't think he even did anything wrong, but what is it? Ro Khanna, one of the senators, was jumping on him and was asking for an apology and this and this and this and this. And JD Vance had this beautiful thing. It was like, look it, dude. Because Khanna said, think of the children, for our children, and um, JD Vance responded that, yeah, I am thinking of the children rather than have this culture, this thing that we're doing now, which doesn't believe in forgiveness. Um, we can do better than this. Um,
Yeah.
so anyhow, that's where my mind goes in terms of this stuff, is sort of being unapologetic.
Well, I mean, it's like whenever anybody yaps at me about privilege, because old white men are supposed to be privileged.
Yeah,
I keep waiting for mine to arrive, but never mind.
I guess.
Uh,
I guess the other way to say it is: will political correctness change? Will there be a reaction against political correctness because it's
oh
becoming
yeah.
so cringe?
Well, there will, and it will be probably quite as stupid as political correctness.
Mm.
I mean, because the whole thing is stupid. I mean, this is one of the things I've been afraid of for a long time, is that when the reaction finally set in, it would be at least as bad as what it was reacting against.
Mm.
Not simply because, historically speaking, that's the way things go. I mean, you can't look. We've created a society that, to a great degree, consecrates infanticide. All right, that is an objective evil that cries to heaven for vengeance. How can anything good possibly come out of that? How can the murder of infants generate anything worthwhile? Now, it leads to questions. Should we just shoot all the abortionists? I can imagine people doing that. I really can. Um, I would hate to live in such a country, uh, even as I hate living in one that murders infants in the first place. You know. Now multiply that by all the other lesser issues, and you run into real problems. I was Vance made a rip roaring speech in Munich, and he identified, I thought, quite correctly, a lot of the issues here in Europe. He would never do that at home, not when it came to things like abortion, divorce, gay marriage, all this stuff, which the president has signed on for.
Hmm.
Nobody will speak truth to the Americans the way he spoke truth to the Europeans.
Hmm.
It's not happening. And those truths he wouldn't speak to the Europeans either, because he'd have to speak them to the Americans. And as a friend of mine said when I made this point to him, he said, well, he's not going to do that because he's not nuts and he wants to be president number 48. Well, okay. So government employment is more important. I get that.
Hmm.
But that's part of the problem. Government employment has always been more important than the truth.
Hmm.
And
Well,
at some point, it has to end. And what that end will be like, I don't know.
you,
Not pretty.
you like to say you like to talk about our income taxes paying for planned for abortion, basically.
Mm.
What would happen if they defund Planned Parenthood?
Oh, then they'd take away a chance for me to spout off.
Yeah. So that
Oh, Planned Parenthood would collapse.
yeah, no, but I mean in terms of I guess we're still culpable on the state level, even though we're I actually don't know how that would work actually if Planned
Well,
Parenthood would operate on the state level.
the way it would work is very simple. The federal, state, and civic level should not fund Planned Parenthood. It's not rocket science. It's
Yeah.
not hard. How come they don't fund cockfighting?
Maybe they do. I don't know. USAID was funding so much. Who knows where any money was going anywhere?
Not cockfighting, I assure you.
No.
No,
Okay.
cockfighting doesn't get funded. I told you, you know what happens when they discover cockfighting rings in Somar.
What happens?
Well, the owners get arrested for animal cruelty. The birds are slaughtered. Now, stop and think about that. No, I'm not advocating cockfighting. That's not my point.
Yeah, yeah.
But the owners of the birds who've raised them for this purpose, they get fined or imprisoned for animal cruelty while the birds are killed.
Do they have a barbecue after?
Well, we don't know about that, but that
Yeah.
was my brother's standing joke. Every time we'd go by the police station in Somar and we smelled frying chicken, my brother would go, I guess they broke up another cockfighting ring. Of
All right.
course, they have a lot of terrible jokes in Hawaii about cockfighting, where it's also a big thing. So they say, you can tell the Samoan at a cockfight.
How?
He brings a duck. You know how you can tell the Portuguese at the cockfight?
How?
He bets on the duck. You know how you can tell when the Hawaiian Mafia is at the cockfight?
How?
The duck wins.
What? This is insane. Okay. Okay.
Well, they tell Samoan and Portuguese jokes in Hawaii.
I see. Okay.
Oh, you're saying that's not okay? Hawaiians aren't allowed the same freedom of other Americans to tell ethnic jokes.
Yes. All right.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's that.
I'm gonna
No,
be
we got that one.
I'm gonna be unapologetic. All right. I'm not gonna bow to the powers that be, whether it's Big Almond or otherwise. All right.
Not even
Um,
Hawaiian cuisine.
Hawaiian cuisine. All right. Another question. To quote JFK, "Victory has a thousand fathers, but defeat is an orphan." While there is truth to this sentiment, victors are also seen as having responsibility for the current state of affairs. Growing up in eastern Kansas, the South losing the war was an avatar for everything bad that has transpired in the last 100 plus years. Namely, the loss of states' rights, including a sliding national moral compass. Recently, in the aftermath of the COVID catastrophe, I wonder if the South had won. Uh, if the South had won, would the South winning be seen as the catalyst for our cultural and spiritual demise? In the same vein, I wonder if the quote unquote patriots were defeated by the loyalists over 200 years ago, would their defeat be romanticized as the death of humanity's last great hope? I have started to believe that we are largely where we are as a result of the Enlightenment. And little could change this trajectory until it collapses under its own weight. Charles, what do you say?
Could be true. I mean, any historian will tell you two things. One, that it's pointless trying to figure out what would have happened. And the other is there's nothing more fun than trying to figure out what would have happened. It's a pointless game that we do love playing. I don't know. You know, if either civil war had ended differently, uh, well, if the first one had ended differently, there would have been perhaps even greater repercussions. You wouldn't have had swarms of loyalists going to Canada, for one thing. Um, you wouldn't have had, well, you would have had a much more activist monarchy in Britain because George III would not have been, uh, not have had his ears cut back. And for that matter, Catholic emancipation probably would have come a lot quicker, which could well have meant a reconciled Ireland. I mean, you know, the minute you leave the established timeline, there's all sorts of stuff that could have happened. Um, I think there's a certain sense in which not just the Enlightenment, but in truth, the Enlightenment itself, I believe, was really the product ultimately of the Protestant revolt. Uh, Simply because the Protestant revolt began as an attack on the authority of the church and said sola scriptura, the Bible only. Now, that unfortunately is something that doesn't make a lot of sense logically, on the one hand, because the Bible was the creation of the church, not the other way around. If you know a bit of history, you know that. So you've got that on the one hand. Then you have these horrific religious wars that followed. The Enlightenment was very much the result, to a great degree, of horror at what quote unquote religious people did to each other during the 30 Years' War and during the religious wars in France. So, you know, if all these people claim to worship the same God and they're slaughtering each other in his name, how can any of it be true? And that affected people like, you know, in the beginning, John Locke and ultimately Voltaire. Um, so it's hard to say. Uh, certainly, certainly things went ever more and more and more in that direction. Um, There's a great book I recommend highly by Kevin Phillips called the Cousins Wars, which sees the Protestant revolt, the Wars of the Three Kingdoms, the Jacobite struggles, the American Revolution, and the American Civil War as successive conflicts in the same basic historical movement. The transformation of the Anglosphere from a little weird kingdom on the edge of Christendom to a Goliath striding the earth. Uh, Hard to say.
Hmm.
I do think that if the revolution had not succeeded, it's quite possible that the capital of the British Empire today would be Philadelphia.
Would it?
Could be. The king wanted to hang out with the majority of his subjects, especially if a continental power had arisen that was capable of invading England. Napoleon couldn't do it, Hitler couldn't do it, but of course they both arose after the horrors of the French Revolution and World War One. But what if a continental power that had not been through the French Revolution arose and managed to put together a fleet, maybe restore the Stuarts,
I don't know.
to have the House of Hanover reigning happily in Philadelphia?
That's a strange thought.
Yep. Meanwhile, the Stuarts would be enjoying the British Isles.
All right, final question for this episode is from Tom, who says, I am about halfway through the podcast production called The Telepathy Tapes. It's mind-blowing. In short, the premise is that there is abundant evidence that many autistic, nonverbal individuals are able to communicate telepathically with parents, teachers, therapists, and peers. I imagine this is not a new phenomenon. Charles, are there any theologians that you are aware of who have dealt with this and have attempted to understand it in the mind of the church? Based on what I have listened to so far, it does not seem to be explicitly New Age or occult, but rather a natural ability that nonverbal people have not lost. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
There could be others, I just don't know them, but the only writer I know of, the only cleric who dealt with this thing, to my knowledge, was Dom Alois Wiesinger, the Cistercian abbot, who wrote a book called Occult Phenomena in the Light of Theology back in the 50s. And he talks about things like precognition and telepathy and all that, and speculates that they might well be remnants of the pre-lapsarian, the period before the fall, way that human beings were. In other words, he theorizes that when these things are natural and not the result of witchcraft or demons or whatever, that they could be sort of a broken remnant of the gifts that mankind had and lost. Sort of.
No, I was gonna say that this is reminiscent of other stuff I've heard about how angels communicate because they don't, you know.
They don't. Yeah. I mean, obviously, all this stuff is speculation anyway, and we've got no way of knowing this side of the grave. But for Dom Alois Wiesinger, he speculated that it might be something, a bit like those people who can play the piano without reading sheet music. They can play it by ear. We had a very good friend of ours, Dave Barron, who could, no relation to Bishop Barron, although it was spelled the same way. But Dave was able to hear anything, and he could play it on the piano, but he couldn't read music to save his soul. And mind you, he wasn't autistic or anything. It's just a skill he had. And there are a lot of people, some of them autistic or Asperger or whatever, who have sort of weird talents like that. And Dom Wiesinger speculates that those might be broken remnants of what was ours before the fall, that come in bits and pieces to different people for reasons we don't really know.
All right. We are at the end of the episode. Any final words, Charles?
Well, yeah. I mean, we got to party like it's 1999.
When it was 1999, did you party hardy?
Oh, man, did I ever. Especially the last night of 1999, New Year's Eve. The end of the old century, of the old millennium. And I threw fears of Y2K beyond me. I didn't do anything to get ready for Y2K. Not a
What was
solitary
to be
thing.
done? There was. Oh, you
Oh,
mean in
people
terms
were,
of like bunker, like get a little.
yeah. People were stocking food, and they were hiding toilet paper or whatever. I mean, it was madness. And I looked at all that and I said, somehow I don't think it's going to be much of anything. And guess what? It wasn't. But to this day, when I want to tease people of a certain age, they ask me if I've done this or I've done that. I say, man, I'm still trying to get ready for Y2K. I don't know. It's hard.
Yeah, a friend of mine. He was I told you this before, but he was worried about an EMP from China. Electromagnetic. It would disable all electricity, and and it's trying to help people out and prep for it. And I remember thinking to myself, gosh, I just don't have the time. Like, even if you're right, even if I completely believed you, I just don't have the bandwidth, honestly.
No,
So
you gotta do what you're doing.
I don't. I just.
You gotta do what you're doing. One thing though that people should remember though, even if they have gotten ready for Y2K, and they are prepared for it, this week, maybe Monday, but certainly Thursday, they should remember those words of the folk song. Can she bake a cherry pie, Billy boy, Billy boy? Can she bake a cherry pie, charming Billy? She can bake a cherry pie and she'll stuff it in your eye. She's a young thing and cannot leave her mother. And you know why you need cherry pie this week?
Washington's birthday?
Bingo. Washington's birthday.
Chop down a cherry tree to bake a cherry pie, I guess?
Yeah, don't tell anyone. I cannot tell a lie, so I'm keeping it to myself.
All right. Okay, what is it if it's Monday, Charles?
Off the menu.
What about the soul you save?
Could be your own.
See you next time, everyone.
God bless all. Happy Mardi Gras.